Woodworker Anonymous here, and table saw crosscut sleds. You know, you're probably thinking about making one right now. That's why you're watching my video. And I'm not going to show you how to make it from soup to nuts. You know, I'm not going to go A to Z on this. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you some tips that you probably haven't gotten anywhere else, because I haven't seen them anywhere else. They're kind of tips that I came up with by myself to help make your table saw sled, or any jig really, that much more accurate, with just a little bit of attention to a couple things that you don't think about every day. Now, this is a very long table saw sled for long crosscuts of longer panels and pieces of wood. You know, I frequently find myself wanting to use a crosscut sled for some longer panel or one by whatever it is. I don't really have the capacity on my chop box because it's not a sliding chop box. So this is going to be very valuable for me in particular, and anybody else who doesn't have a sliding miter saw. So one of the big problems with these type of sleds, larger sleds, is weight, and they become very unwieldy. They start to become difficult to push around. So in effort to keep it manageable, I focused a lot on weight and weight reduction. So this is 1/2" plywood for the base. This helps in keeping the weight down. You could even go 3/8 if you want to keep it down even lower. For the structural parts here to hold these two together, 2 halves of the sled, I'm using redwood. This is extremely lightweight wood. It's very durable, holds screws very well. It's also very straight and has very little wood movement to it. It's excellent for something like that. And since we're talking about a long sled, we have a long fence, and weight becomes an issue here because typically you make the fence out of a thicker piece, and so I went the same route here. I used 1/2" plywood for the front and back, and I sandwiched it with some redwood, which again is very light, and it's actually hollow in the middle. The redwood does hold screws extremely well. It's also dimensionally very stable and very light. Great wood for making this kind of composite put together on a fence. Keeps this fence very light. People talk mostly about squaring the blade to the fence, making sure you got it perfectly square. Very important to do that, but probably more important than that, especially on a sled like this with a long fence, this fence needs to be dead straight. I mean, dead straight. It can't have any kind of a wobble, you know, wave, any kind of bow, and there's not a lot of attention paid to that in most of the videos out here on table saw sleds. So, you know, it's not that difficult to make sure it's flat. You know, if you have a nice flat reference surface, my workbench is very, very flat. So I use this when I make the composite fence. People like to glue 2 pieces of plywood together. They'll maybe make sure that the bows are opposing each other, and when they glue them together, they just say, well, that just evens out the bow and it makes it flat. Well, it might be true for a shorter fence, but for a long fence like that, that's just not going to cut it. We're trying to get within thousandths of an inch on the squareness. Your fence has got to be within thousandths of an inch on a 48" long fence like this. So this was important. Cut these pieces to size, glued them and clamped them to a reference surface so that they dried. Okay, perfectly flat. You could, if you don't have something like this, you could use maybe a long level. If you have one of those 4-foot levels, you can clamp to the base of that, and also do the same thing. It'll make sure that your fence is glued and dries in a perfectly flat reference. And that's, once it's dry, this has become, believe it or not, this is extremely stiff now. That is not going to bend. This it's kind of like a torsion box almost. But that composite build makes this very straight and very resistant to bending. Also lightweight. Number 1, when you're installing a T-track like this, if you're doing it with an aluminum T-track, a couple things I think are important. Number 1, I've seen a lot of people like to glue these in or epoxy them in. They don't want to mess with the screws, the flathead screws, and possibly catching like your your stop block or something with a protruding nail head or screw head, I mean. But listen, make sure you just get the right size screw head so that it fits in the recess, and you won't have a problem with that. One of the reasons I think it's important that you really want to go with the screws instead of the glue is, number one, you want to be able to take this out if you need to. Maybe you want to repurpose these T-tracks in a different type of jig altogether. When you glue them in, that's permanent, you know, and it's going to create a nightmare for trying to get it out, clean it up, and use it in something else. Use the screws, they're plenty strong, and use the right size screw head. It'll go in, we'll have no problem. You know, I'm always changing things up here in the shop, so it's important for me to be able to take this apart and use it in something else if I need to do that. Okay, that's one big one. Let me give you another big one. When you're installing this, everybody wants to, or thinks that they want to install these flush with the wood or the actual fence itself, maybe even a slight bit under. I don't like that. I'll tell you why. When you tighten down your stop block, and in my case I have one of these Cat's Moses stop blocks, but it's true for any stop block. You're going to run this in your channel. When you tighten this up, okay, and the T-channel, the T-track, is just a tad bit proud of the wood around it. When you tighten this down, all it does is squeeze these two pieces together, and you can crank on this as much as you want, and all it's going to do is make these tighter and tighter together. That's what you want. What you don't want is for this to be just a tiny bit underneath the surface of the wood, because as you tighten this down, what it does is the stop block is going to rest on the wood, and it's going to try and pull the T-track up to it. And if you have glue or screws in here, it's going to start to pull it up. It's also going to start to bend the little rails here, because the pressure pulling up to try to squeeze these two together could possibly bend the little flanges here on the T-track. You know, this little thing could get bent up a little bit. So make sure that it's just a little bit proud. Tighten it up all you want. Nothing's going to bend. Nothing's going to try to pull itself apart. It's just going to pull it together. Okay, another advantage to having the slightly elevated T-track to the wood around it is it gives you a nice place to put one of these self-stick rulers underneath, and you won't have to worry about, you know, sliding the stop block and like wearing the numbers off or doing any just damage to this over time. You know, this T-track's a little proud, all the contacts between the T-track and the stop block. This sits just below, and you know, it allows this thing to slide, and it's just another advantage to being very careful about the depth of your T-track, making sure it's just a little bit proud. And bottom of the sled, the runners. Here's another big tip for you guys. You've seen a lot of videos on picking the hardwood or the plastic or HDPE, whatever it is that people want to make these runners out of, and there's all kinds of solutions and talk about it. But listen, I use plywood. Okay, you don't hear a lot of people talking about that. This is 3/8 inch plywood, and it's actually, most 3/8 inch plywood, as you know, is not exactly 3/8. It's just a tad under. It'll fit depth-wise perfectly for what we want in the miter slots of almost every table saw out there. So why do I pick plywood? Well, it's something that I know is not going to change width with varying humidity. I got a garage workshop. I'm in the Northeast. It gets crazy humid in the summer, crazy dry in the winter. When I used hardwood runners, they would invariably swell in the summer and they would shrink in the winter. So if I made it when it was in the winter time, it would stick in the summer. If I made it in the summertime, they would be sloppy in the winter time. This was, I mean, and I've tried maple, I've tried oak. It's just a nightmare. And you know, first of all, it's more expensive. You have to find nice wood for that. Second of all, they didn't work that well. If you work in a shop that's the humidity is totally controlled, that's fine. That'll work for you. If you're in a shop like mine in your garage, plywood is just an unbelievably great material for these runners. Extremely cheap. You probably have some laying around, and you can take your time on the table saw, you know, dialing in the perfect width, just getting that fence set up just right. And once you get it and it's perfect fit in your miter slot, you know, just take that plywood and just run it through a bunch of times. You know, make 15 of these, make 25 of these things. You know, they're great. You take these things, I throw them underneath the shelf in my workbench. Whenever I need to make a jig, I just pull a couple out. And I know they're dead right. And, you know, it doesn't matter if they bow a little bit like this, because you're obviously going to screw and glue them down to the bottom of whatever jig you're going to use. Thinking maybe some people don't like to use them because they're afraid of not hard enough. Or, listen, you can scratch this, dent it, take a little chunk out of it, but guess what? 99.99% of the width of this thing is perfect, and it's going to stay that way. No matter, I can bang on this with a screwdriver and hammer all day long, it's still going to fit in that slot. I've been doing this for years. This works great. Nobody does this. I don't know why. Trust me, this works, especially if you have an outdoor garage workshop like mine. Okay, you guys, so one final tip, okay? You've built your table saw sled. You got your stop block ready to go, and now you need to install like some kind of tape or measuring tape on top or on the back, wherever you want to install it, but you know, trying to get it exactly right. Now, a lot of stop blocks will have a little adjustable dial on the magnifying glass or something like that, that they can line that up and fine tune it afterwards, but with this particular stop block, that doesn't exist. And so simple thing we're going to do here is just tighten this down in a random place, and then I'm just going to run this piece of wood right through. Take a very close measurement on the leftover here. It tells me exactly how far away my stop block is from the cutting blade. Then I'll go to the tape measure that I'm going to install here on the top surface, and what I'll do, I'm just going to cut that like adhesive right there. Start peeling it back right at the spot that is the measurement of this piece of wood. I'm going to slide it underneath my stop block. I'm going to bring it right up perfectly to the edge of the stop block, put it down, and then peel the rest of the tape adhesive backer off on both directions and secure it. And that should give me an absolutely perfect setup with the tape measure and whatever stop block it is you're using. You may not need to do this if you have like an adjustable measuring device on the actual stop block, but if you just have a basic stop block like this where you like slide along and you have to use the actual stop block edge, this is the easiest way to get a really accurate measurement and install it first time the right way, so you don't have to start peeling it off and then ruining the adhesive on the back. You know, hopefully these tips will help you in whatever shop jig you're looking to build right now. Appreciate you stopping and watching the video. Get out and shop, guys. Have some fun, and I'll catch you next time.